I'm Dr David Cumin with the Israel Institute of New Zealand. We're putting together a voter's guide for Kiwis interested in the 2020 election and New Zealand's relationship with Israel. Today I've got MP Simon O'Connor from the National Party with us. He's MP for Tamaki and, among other roles, is Chair of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee. Thank you for your time, Simon.
A pleasure.
Last year, you and one of your national colleagues, Todd McClay, said that New Zealand should think about moving the ambassador to Israel from Turkey into Israel. What advantages do you think that would bring?
Well, fundamentally, I see the New Zealand-Israeli relationship should be one that's really, really strong, and that we are and should be good friends. And I think one of the best ways to show that is that you have your ambassador in that host country. So in this case, a New Zealand ambassador in Israel.
Why do you think it hasn't happened yet?
I think unfortunately it's been caught up in the whole politics between Israel and Palestine, and I think there are those here in New Zealand who would prefer to see that relationship made more distant, and I think that's incredibly unhelpful.
And you also said in your speech that New Zealand should rethink the way that we approach Israel. What other things, other than moving the ambassador, do you think should happen?
Oh, I think a lot of it comes down to actually increasing our trade, our engagement with one another. There's so much that our countries can learn from each other. I mean, Israel's areas in technology, agriculture, I mean, we've got that expertise as well. So I think there's a lot more that could be shared there. And fundamentally, it's actually about developing friendships. And you do that by closer engagement.
So the innovation agreement that was recently signed is a positive step forward?
Absolutely, finally. It's taken a few years, but I'm really pleased to see that that's been signed. And again, that's a step in the right direction. If you want to have meaningful engagement, you develop friendships, and in even the wider concept of sort of peace in the Middle East, you do it again by engaging, by being friendly. You don't do that by running away.
So you've obviously answered one of the questions that we've got on our voters guide. The other question is, I would think that friends would also stand up for their friends when there's times of trouble, and unfortunately there's been hundreds of terror attacks over the last little while. Last year MFAT, for the first time in 13 years, condemned terror against Israel. Why do you think New Zealand seems out of step with our traditional allies in condemning terror?
I think there's a funny dynamic starting in the country, particularly in the political realm, of either having to choose one side or the other in the Middle East conflict. And I think it's also creating a blinkeredness, or a blinkeredness comes from that. I think New Zealand should call out all acts of terror all the time. I mean, we try to put ourselves, or we supposedly put ourselves forward as strong, independent foreign policy people. Well, then we should be speaking up on these things.
And one of the things that I think is driving some of the terrorism is the indoctrination within Arab Palestinian society. We've seen recently a report from the Henry Jackson Society that shows children as young as 6 are taught that violent jihad is something to aspire to. And this teaching is going on in schools that New Zealand funds through a UN organisation. The UK is now debating this in Parliament. Australians are now debating this in their officialdom. The US pulled funding last year because of it, in part. Why do you think New Zealand hasn't had that discussion yet?
Look, I'm not exactly sure why we haven't had the discussion, but I'm really clear that we need to. Where UNRWA's funding's been going, or the questions around it, are very, very serious in and of themselves, even before you discuss New Zealand's funding of it. That needs to be addressed, and of course once we've addressed the question of what they're doing, why is New Zealand part of this, supporting it financially? So I think a really strong and mature conversation's needed about this almost right now.
Well, now would be a good time to have it, and hopefully we will have it in a broader context as well. Unfortunately, indoctrinating children to terror, the terror that's going on, isn't a good pathway forward for long-term peace. But in your mind, what would you see the longer-term solution as being, and what part can New Zealand possibly play?
Oh, look, I personally am still committed that it has to be a two-state solution. New Zealand is still committed to that. But I think fundamentally New Zealand's role is, as I touched on earlier, you have to be friends with people. You can't have mature, proper conversations if you're not being friendly and respectful, and I think New Zealand needs to be that towards Israel. The other is, I suppose, if New Zealand's called upon to help engage or support in some way, it should be open to it, but I'd add to that, New Zealand shouldn't be trying to interfere or strongly pick one side over the other or play silly politics. I just don't think that helps the wider process.
Thank you. Well, hopefully New Zealand can play a much more productive role and not pick one side or the other moving forward. Thank you so much for your time.
A pleasure. Thanks, David.